when you have a revolution in the country, the first thing you take over is the radio. And then you start telling the people, everybody, the war is over. And so all of them surrender. No, they believe that thing right there. And once they take that over, they start telling you where you are and where they are, and you fall right in line. It's plain thought control. The majority of the American people aren't segregationists. That the majority of the American people aren't imperialists. But the government is, the structure is, the power faction is. So, how then do all the majority go along with it? Because those who sit in power over the television, over the radio, and over the press is constantly telling those who are the masses how free they are, and how this they are, and how that they are. This is the trick that's played on everyone who's oppressed.
In the 1960s, African Americans were denied the civil liberties that were promised to them by the Declaration of Independence. Segregation was in effect across the country, and while some businesses were beginning to integrate their establishments, a great majority were refusing to make changes. One of the ways African Americans fought against this was through sit-ins, a form of civil disobedience in which they would enter into a whites-only section and ask for service. The business decision to refuse service was not backed by law, but by local custom. Although the sit-ins were demonstrated peacefully, they were met with hostility by white opposition. When violence broke out and arrests were made, the demonstrators, not the white perpetrators, were labeled as troublemakers for causing the disturbances. Former President Harry S. Truman once said, "If anyone came into my store and tried to stop business, I'd throw them out. The Negro should behave himself and show he's a good citizen." The sit-ins were reframed as not being about rights, but about obeying law and order. How the acts of protest were portrayed by media and by those in power showed opposition or support of the movement. Their deliberate and careful way of describing and reporting on the demonstrations would come to shape how the protests were received by the public. The combative back and forth between two opposing sides used the media as not only information sharer, but as interpreter and influencer. This was until 4 students of Agriculture and Technical College in Greensboro, North Carolina, were determined to not only fight for their rights, but also understood the effect of media and how it would be used to show support or opposition. The students, Joseph McNeil, Azelle Blair, Franklin McCain, and David Richmond, walked into a Woolworth's department store, purchased several items, and sat down at the lunch counter reserved for white customers and asked for service. They were denied, and the police were called. Once the police arrived, they were unable to take action because of lack of provocation. The students were civil, polite, and held their composure, and in return, the police were unable to make arrests. The store closed early, and the manager of the store believed that the incident was over. What he didn't know at that time was that the sit-in wasn't an impulse decision by the students, but had been carefully planned and orchestrated. The day before the sit-in, the 4 college students met with Ralph Johns, a local clothing store owner who sympathized with them and wanted to help. He had talked with them about what they were going to do, gave them clothing to wear, and had arranged to reach out to reporters to cover the demonstration. When the students left the diner, they were greeted by a photographer, and the next day, the story ran in the Greensboro Record. After leaving the store, the students told campus leaders at A&T what had happened, and the following day, the students came back to Woolworth's and had over 24 students to join them in their demonstrations. The media coverage expanded, and TV and national newspapers began to report on the sit-ins. The way in which the events were being reported on by the media outlets informed viewers how they should feel about the sit-ins. The Greensboro Record wrote an editorial citing the movement as a disturbance. Undoubtedly, the students' sit-down demand for service at the lunch counter will be cited by some persons as evidence that the Negroes are pushing for social privileges as well as legal right. The white leadership of the community can ill afford to be passive and indifferent under the circumstances. The manager and employees of the Woolworths tried to ignore the students and exclusively serve only the white customers. When asked about the sit-ins, J.W. Largen, the district superintendent of Woolworths, tried to dismiss the refusal of service as being race-related. "We haven't refused anybody. Our girls have been busy and they couldn't get around to everybody." But the reach of the networks was greater than that of the local newspapers, and residents across the state began to hear about the sit-ins. Students from the college were moved by the reports and had come down to show their support, but likewise, so did the opposition. On the third day, the demonstrations would be met with strong resistance. Members of the KKK and other white nationalists came down to fill the restaurant ahead of the students, hoping to deny them the opportunity to sit in. They attacked, taunted, and tried to provoke the black students. The media reported on the assaults committed by the white opposition, which only contrasted against the civility of the college students. In most cases, the demonstrators sat or stood at store counters talking in low voices, studying or staring impassively at their tormentors. The effect of the coverage of the violence made by the white antagonists would only add to the support of the students. "We don't expect violence," a demonstrator said, "but if it comes, we will meet it with passive resistance." By February 5th, 300 students had come to the store to show support, and the movement spread to 40 other cities across the country. The following day, 1,400 students had come to the sit-ins and to the nearby businesses that supported the same segregation practices. After receiving a bomb threat, the students voted to suspend the demonstrations to give the government officials and business leaders a chance to reply. The negotiations fell through, and the students resumed the sit-ins. The city and the stores thought the protesters would give up and move on to something else, but for the next few months the protests continued and grew. The news coverage of the sit-ins showed a divided nation, but the activists demonstrated a united front, and the fight for civil rights continued to spread across the country. Peaceful acts of civil disobedience were happening at businesses all over America, and the media were always there covering the events, with many giving their voice of support or disapproval. The Journal and Sentinel newspaper wrote, "It may be wise to keep the lunch counters closed here for the time being, but it is logical to suggest that when they are opened again, that they be opened on a desegregated basis." While the Wall Street Journal came out against the demonstration, and the Washington Star wrote, "There is both a right and wrong approach to the problem, and these demonstrations are taking the wrong approach." The newspaper, Rice Thresher, ran an editorial. "The Negroes fighting for rights which they in truth have no claim to have lost the support among the moderates in the South and have done themselves more harm than good." The college's official stances on the matter were intentionally obtuse. Harold Hudson, president of the Greensboro College, said that the students were acting as individual students and not connected with the college, while Dean Gamble of A&T said that the university had no authority to restrict students' private activities of this kind. As the sit-ins and movements grew, political leadership responded to the movements with criticism and apathy. Governor of North Carolina, Luther Hodges, released a statement on March 13 that stated he had no sympathy for the sit-in demonstrators, who deliberately engage in activities which any reasonable person can see will result in a breakdown of law and order. When asked about his stance on the matter, President Eisenhower replied with indifference, "I am one of those persons that believes there is too much interference in the private affairs, and you might say personal lives already, and I would like to diminish rather than increase it," and that he would reserve judgment on the sit-down disorders. While the response from the colleges, political representatives, and media showed disapproval of the demonstration, that was not reflected on the ground, and the numbers grew at the sit-ins and in such large numbers that it not only led to the shutting down of the department store, but to all of the downtown area of Greensboro. The constant opposition, the growth in numbers, the decline in business eventually led the city and store owners to relinquish. And on July 26th, Woolworths integrated its lunch counter. When asked about the sit-ins years later, manager of Woolworths, C.L. Harris, responded by saying that he actually supported integration and that it was his decision to not make arrests, and that integration would not have come any other way except through direct action by the Negro. He explains that his main issue with the sit-ins was the loss of business it had on the store and is the reason for the store's decision to integrate. That it was the decline in sales from his black customers that wiped out the store's profits. While the integration of Woolworths and other nearby businesses was a victory for the students, it was met with little attention. By the time the restaurant was desegregated, it was too late and the country had moved on. The lunch counters of a department store were only a small part of the bigger issues this country was facing, and the racial injustices and civil rights movement had continued to grow. A few years after the Greensboro sit-ins, over 250,000 people joined Martin Luther King Jr. in the March on Washington, and in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions, divisions which have lasted all too long.
Thousands of sit-ins and marches across the country occurred, and every demonstration was fought with restraint and dignity by the protesters. The hostility they endured while protesting peacefully showed the country the violence and abuse they had to suffer, regardless of how any news outlet or political leader would try and frame it. While much of the authority of the country treated the civil rights movement with apathy and opposition, this feeling was not reflected by the people. The Greensboro Four started a chain reaction that inspired and informed the country on how to combat the oppressive forces of racism. If the civil rights movement was going to cause political and social change, then the coverage by the media was going to play a vital role.